The town rested in a shallow fold of land where time seemed to hesitate, as though uncertain whether to move forward or remain bound to the habits of the past, and for generations it had existed in a state of quiet endurance, shaped not by progress, but by repetition. Stone houses clustered along narrow paths, worn smooth by centuries of feet, their walls darkened by smoke and damp, their roofs heavy with moss that crept slowly but persistently, mirroring the way life itself advanced there. Each morning began with the same unspoken agreement between people and light. As shutters opened, animals stirred, and bodies rose not from eagerness, but from obligation, because the work of the day waited regardless of health or hope. Fields stretched outward beyond the last houses, divided by low walls, and memory rather than precise measure, and they demanded constant attention, their soil stubborn and unforgiving, yielding sustenance only to those who labored without question. The people believed this labor pleased unseen powers, whether divine or natural, and that diligence itself served as a form of protection against misfortune. Illness was not unknown to them, yet it arrived in familiar forms tied to cold seasons, hunger, or age, and it followed patterns that could be endured, named, and eventually forgotten. Death itself was woven into daily life, acknowledged with resignation rather than fear, as something that moved predictably and spared the young often enough to allow the town to continue. Beneath this surface stability lay a shared understanding that the world was ruled by forces beyond comprehension, and that safety was temporary, granted without explanation and withdrawn without warning. This belief shaped their rituals, their silences, and their obedience to tradition, which they followed not out of reverence, but from the instinctive fear that deviation might invite attention from powers best left undisturbed. Long before the sickness arrived, there were signs that later generations would interpret as warnings, though at the time they passed unnoticed or were dismissed as coincidence. Livestock weakened without visible cause, grain spoiled despite careful storage, and a strange stillness settled over certain mornings when even birds seemed reluctant to break the air with sound. These moments were absorbed into the fabric of daily struggle, attributed to weather or chance, and life continued forward along its narrow and familiar path. When the first human fell ill, there was nothing to distinguish the event from countless others that had come before. A sudden exhaustion that lingered too long, a fever that burned without explanation, a body that failed despite no visible wound. Care was given according to custom, with herbs gathered from the hills, rest offered where possible, and prayers murmured more from habit than expectation, and when death followed, it was accepted as another turn of the wheel. Yet the illness did not end there, nor did it respect the invisible boundaries that once contained such misfortune. It moved quietly, spreading not through dramatic collapse, but through absence, through people failing to appear at their usual places, through tools left untouched, through doors that remained closed after sunrise. Fear did not arrive all at once, but seeped slowly into the town's awareness as patterns began to form where none should exist, as deaths clustered without regard for age or strength, and as recovery became rare rather than expected. Bodies grew weak in unfamiliar ways, breath shortened, minds clouded, and those afflicted withdrew from others, not only from pain, but from an emerging understanding that proximity itself might carry danger. Without knowledge of cause, the people searched for meaning in belief, concluding that such suffering could not exist without purpose. And they turned inward, examining sins real and imagined, weighing their lives against the calamity unfolding around them. Some believed the air itself had turned against them, corrupted by unseen rot rising from the earth, while others saw the sickness as a judgment delivered slowly and without mercy. Remedies multiplied as fear deepened, guided not by effectiveness, but by desperation. As bitter mixtures were consumed despite their harm, smoke filled homes in the hope of cleansing invisible taint. Blood was drawn to release imagined poisons, and fasting was embraced as both penance and defense. Those who could afford isolation withdrew, sealing themselves away from the town, while others were forced into solitude by the suspicion of their neighbors, left to weaken unseen behind closed doors. Daily life continued only because it had to, stripped of warmth and reduced to necessity, as fields were tended by fewer hands, bread baked in silence, and animals left unattended when their keepers failed to rise. Burials became swift and unmarked, carried out without gathering or ceremony, as the living learned to move quickly past grief in order to preserve what strength remained. The market faded into memory, replaced by shuttered stalls and empty spaces where voices once overlapped, and the streets grew quiet enough that footsteps echoed where they never had before. Authority responded, as it always did, in the absence of understanding, by enforcing order in visible ways, closing roads, marking homes, restricting movement, and increasing rituals meant to appease forces that could neither be seen nor reasoned with. These measures created divisions sharper than walls, separating the healthy from the suspected, the obedient from the defiant, and trust eroded under the weight of fear. As the sickness spread, the town transformed not through destruction, but through subtraction, losing people, sound, and certainty, until what remained was a hollowed version of itself, standing intact yet altered beyond recognition. And in this altered state it waited, suspended between endurance and collapse, uncertain whether the darkness passing through it would ever truly release its hold. As days accumulated without clear distinction, the town's sense of time began to fracture, measured no longer by work completed or bells heard, but by who had vanished since the last sunrise, and memory itself became unreliable as faces blurred together in the mind of those who remained. Fear altered behavior in subtle ways before it did so openly, shaping posture, shortening glances, and turning once familiar movements into cautious rituals performed at a distance. People avoided touching shared tools when possible, lingered less in doorways, and learned to read the slightest change in another's breathing or gait as a potential warning. Children were kept indoors, not out of safety, but out of superstition, their confinement marked by restlessness and confusion rather than understanding, while the elderly were left increasingly alone, assumed to be closest to death, and therefore already claimed in spirit, if not yet in body. The illness itself shifted in its presentation, sometimes arriving with sudden weakness that bent the strongest laborer, sometimes creeping in slowly as fatigue that deepened into fever and delirium, and sometimes sparing the body while unraveling the mind, leaving those afflicted disoriented and withdrawn even before physical decline became visible. Without knowledge of transmission, the people constructed their own patterns of blame, avoiding certain houses, paths, and families, convinced that moral failure or inherited corruption explained why some were struck while others were not. These beliefs hardened quickly, because certainty, even false certainty, offered relief from the chaos of not knowing, and soon the town was divided not only by sickness, but by judgment. Remedies became increasingly severe as gentler attempts failed, and pain was accepted as a necessary cost if survival could be purchased through suffering. Bloodletting was performed more frequently, weakening bodies already taxed by illness, while stronger incenses were burned until homes filled with choking smoke that drove the healthy into coughing fits indistinguishable from the first signs of disease. Isolation became policy rather than choice, enforced by fear rather than authority, as those suspected of illness were sealed away with whatever provisions could be spared, left to recover alone or perish unseen. Some resisted this fate and fled into the surrounding hills and forests, believing distance alone could sever the invisible thread of sickness. But many of those who left were never seen again, either claimed by the disease or lost to hunger, exposure, or violence beyond the town's borders. Despite all this, the machinery of survival continued to grind forward, fueled by necessity rather than hope. Fields were harvested late or not at all, grain spoiled in damp storage, and animals roamed untended until they broke free or collapsed from neglect, their presence in the streets another reminder of order unraveling. The soundscape of the town changed, stripped of laughter, bargaining, and communal prayer, replaced by wind, coughing, and the dull, repetitive noises of solitary labor. Burials multiplied to the point that graves blurred together, hastily dug and poorly marked, and the earth itself seemed saturated with loss, its surface uneven from hurried hands that no longer paused to mourn. Those tasked with handling the dead grew numb, not out of cruelty, but exhaustion, their senses dulled by repetition, until the act of burial felt no different from any other labor required to see the day through. Authority, strained by its own losses, resorted to harsher measures, reinforcing restrictions and punishing those who defied isolation or attempted to conceal sickness, not because such actions proved effective, but because visible enforcement maintained the illusion that the disaster could still be controlled. Religious observances increased in frequency and intensity, driven by the belief that louder devotion might reach whatever power had unleashed the plague, and public acts of repentance were encouraged as a means of collective purification. These gatherings, meant to restore unity, instead deepened fear, as the proximity they required contradicted the instinct for distance that survival now demanded. Trust, once maintained through shared labor and mutual dependence, eroded further, replaced by calculation and suspicion, as each person weighed compassion against risk and often chose withdrawal. As the months dragged on, the plague no longer shocked, but settled into the town like a permanent feature of life. Its presence assumed rather than questioned, its toll accepted with weary resignation. People stopped asking when it would end, and focused instead on enduring the next day, the next task, the next quiet loss, and in doing so, they surrendered something less visible, but equally vital, the belief that suffering moved toward resolution, rather than perpetuating itself without reason. The town persisted in this diminished state, neither alive in the way it once had been, nor entirely dead, suspended in a slow decay that blurred the line between survival and mere continuation, waiting without expectation for an end that might arrive, not as salvation, but simply as absence. As the plague pressed deeper into its course, the town reached a state where loss no longer announced itself with shock or disbelief, but arrived as a dull certainty, anticipated even before it revealed its mark. And this expectation altered the inner lives of those who remained more profoundly than any visible ruin. People woke each day with the quiet assumption that absence would greet them somewhere along its length, a door unopened, a path unused, a task left undone. And this anticipation flattened emotion until grief itself became a background weight rather than a distinct event. Memory began to fail, not because of age or illness, but because the mind resisted holding too many endings at once, and faces once known in detail blurred into a general sense of having been surrounded by others who were no longer there. The illness continued to move unpredictably, flaring in clusters before retreating without explanation, leaving behind pockets of silence that spread unevenly through the town. And this unevenness deepened the sense that fate, rather than behavior, governed survival. Those who remained healthy did not feel spared, but merely delayed, moving through their days with a heightened awareness of bodily sensation, monitoring breath, warmth, and fatigue with obsessive attention, interpreting every ache as a possible beginning. Physical weakness became widespread, even among the uninfected, driven by hunger, stress, and relentless labor. And mental exhaustion manifested as withdrawal, apathy, and an increasing inability to imagine a future beyond the immediate cycle of survival. The boundaries between the sick and the healthy grew indistinct as fear itself produced symptoms that mirrored the disease, and in this confusion, people began to isolate themselves preemptively, reducing contact to the bare minimum required to keep essential tasks functioning. Houses that once held multiple generations now sheltered single occupants or stood empty altogether, their contents left untouched, slowly decaying under dust and damp as reminders of lives interrupted. Authority, having exhausted both caution and ritual, shifted toward preservation of structure rather than people, focusing on maintaining roads, storage, and order not out of optimism, but from the belief that if the town survived in form, it might one day be repopulated or remembered as something other than a ruin. This focus hardened decision-making, and compassion was increasingly sacrificed to efficiency, with resources diverted away from the weak toward those deemed capable of sustaining labor. Such choices fractured what remained of communal identity, transforming neighbors into competitors for survival, and reducing cooperation to calculated necessity rather than shared obligation. Religious belief, once a source of explanation, began to splinter as prayers went unanswered, and suffering continued without discernible pattern, leading some to intensify devotion while others abandoned ritual altogether, not in rebellion, but in quiet resignation. The landscape around the town reflected its inner collapse, as fields lay fallow, paths overgrew, and the surrounding wilderness crept closer, reclaiming spaces once shaped by human effort. Wildlife moved more freely through abandoned areas, unafraid of people who no longer asserted dominance through presence, and this intrusion of the natural world underscored the fragility of human order when stripped of numbers and energy. Seasons turned with indifference, marking time through weather rather than celebration, and each change brought new challenges that the diminished population struggled to meet, whether through cold that penetrated poorly maintained homes, or heat that accelerated decay and exhaustion. As the plague's intensity began, almost imperceptibly, to wane, it did not announce itself through recovery, but through the simple absence of new cases, a slowing that went unnoticed at first, because hope had long since learned not to expect improvement. Deaths still occurred, driven by the accumulated damage of months of deprivation, and it was only over time that the realization emerged that the sickness itself was no longer advancing with the same force. This realization did not bring relief so much as uncertainty, as the people had lived so long under threat that the idea of its retreat felt unfamiliar and unstable. Caution persisted even as fear softened. Habits of isolation remained, and the town continued to function in its reduced form, unsure whether the plague's silence marked an ending or merely another pause before return. Those who had survived carried the weight of adaptation, shaped by months of vigilance and loss, and even as the immediate danger receded, the transformation it had wrought within them showed no sign of reversal, leaving the town suspended between recovery and permanent diminishment, altered not only in body, but in spirit, waiting to discover whether endurance alone could ever restore what had been stripped away. When the plague finally loosened its grip in a way that could no longer be denied, it did so without ceremony, leaving behind a quiet that differed from the earlier silence, because it was no longer sharpened by immediate fear, but dulled by aftermath. The town did not awaken to celebration or relief, for the habit of expectation had been trained toward loss, and improvement arrived so gradually that it felt less like change than like the absence of further subtraction. Days passed without new marks appearing on doors, without the sudden disappearance of those who had risen at dawn, and this continuity unsettled the survivors more than renewed disaster might have, because it demanded a recalibration of instincts long conditioned by vigilance. Those who ventured farther from their homes did so cautiously, rediscovering streets that felt both familiar and estranged, their surfaces altered by neglect, their corners occupied by weeds and debris that spoke to the months when no one had the strength to clear them. Empty houses stood as the most visible testament to what had been taken, their doors ajar or sealed, their contents preserved in arrested decay, holding tools mid-task, garments folded and never worn again, beds that bore the faint impression of bodies long since removed. The survivors moved past these structures with restrained attention, avoiding prolonged focus not from superstition, but from an understanding that memory itself had become a burden capable of undoing fragile stability. Efforts to restore routine resumed not with enthusiasm, but with caution, as fields were slowly reclaimed, animals gathered, and storage inspected for what little remained usable, each task performed with the awareness that strength had limits, and that ambition could invite collapse. Authority softened its grip not because it acknowledged error, but because enforcement required energy that no longer existed in abundance, and rules once imposed with severity faded into suggestion, then into memory, leaving behind a patchwork of habits shaped by individual judgment rather than communal decree. Religious practice settled into a quieter form, stripped of urgency and spectacle, as those who remained sought meaning not in explanation, but in endurance, and belief adjusted itself to accommodate survival without answers. The plague's retreat did not restore trust, which returned slowly, if at all. altered by the months when proximity had been dangerous, and compassion risky, and relationships reformed along narrower lines, guided by familiarity and shared experience rather than openness. Children who had been kept indoors emerged older in manner than in years, shaped by silence and restraint, while adults carried physical weakness that lingered beyond the illness itself, their bodies marked by hunger and exhaustion that no season could quickly erase. As time extended forward, the town began to mark its history, not by dates but by before and after. And this division structured memory in a way that resisted reconciliation, making the past feel unreachable and the future uncertain. Stories of the plague were told without detail, reduced to general impressions of loss and survival, because specificity threatened to reopen wounds that had only just begun to close. Travelers eventually returned, cautiously at first, then with greater frequency, bringing news that confirmed the town's suffering was neither unique nor exceptional, and this knowledge offered little comfort, reinforcing instead the sense that catastrophe moved freely through the world, indifferent to preparation or virtue. The town persisted, diminished in number and ambition, but stabilized through routine, finding a new equilibrium defined by restraint and remembrance rather than growth. Fields produced less, markets remained modest, and gatherings were smaller and quieter, yet life continued in a form that was neither restored nor entirely broken. The memory of the plague settled into the stones and paths, carried forward not as a warning that could be heeded, but as a presence that shaped behavior without instruction, reminding those who lived there that survival had not been earned through wisdom or strength, but granted through chance and time. In this understanding, the town endured, aware that what had passed could pass again, and that the silence left behind was not an ending, but a pause, one that allowed life to continue, while never fully releasing the shadow that had once moved through it, and could, without announcement, return.